Welcome back to the Introduction to Watercolor class. In today's video, I'm going to be demonstrating shaded forms. Being able to render accurate value structures on three-dimensional forms is as, if not more important than being able to render accurate color. So in today's demonstration, I'm going to show you how to manipulate watercolor to create convincing shadows. And the two types of shadows we'll look at today are form shadows. These are the darker areas that are on the form itself, for instance, the dark side of an object. And cast shadows. These are shadows which are cast or thrown onto another surface, such as the tabletop or another object. We first need to start with a contour line drawing of each of the forms we're going to paint today. I'm working on a cold press 90-pound piece of watercolor paper, and I've divided it in half both vertically and horizontally. You can use a ruler. I just did this freehand, and I want to divide it into 4 different sections. In the upper left, I'm going to start with a sphere, and the technique I use to create a sphere is to very lightly create a circle over and over again, a circle shape. Then I take my pencil and with a bit more pressure emphasize the correct shape in there. I'm also going to create an ellipse very lightly at the bottom right to indicate a cast shadow. In the upper right, I'm lightly going to draw a simple cube shape. A quick and easy cube can be drawn with a series of 3 sets of 3 parallel lines. So I lightly sketch that in, and then I take my pencil and with a bit more pressure emphasize the correct lines within there. And then I'm just going to indicate a real light basic shape for a cast shadow on the right side of that cube. In the bottom left box, I'm creating a cylinder. And first I lightly draw 2 ellipses, one right over top of each other. And then I connect those 2 ellipses with vertical lines for the sides. Now I'm going to take my pencil and emphasize those correct lines. Then I will lightly indicate a cast shadow. The last shape in the bottom right is going to be a cone. This one I'm going to draw by creating a very light vertical line, and then toward the bottom of that vertical line I'm going to center an ellipse within there, and that will give me the curve for the bottom of the cone. Now I take my pencil and I indicate with a little bit more pressure those correct lines for the outer edges of the cone. Then I'll create sort of a triangular shape off to the side for the cast shadow. Now we're ready to paint in the values on these forms. You can actually pick any color that you want to for this, and really the only color I would rule out for this is yellow, just because it's so light. The rest of the colors are dark enough that you can get a full range of value from light to dark. I decided to use black. I'm only going to be mixing 2 values of my color today. My first value I'm going to mix in the center of the palette. It's going to be a very, very dark version of black. And so it's still a liquid, but it has a good proportion of pigment with not nearly as much water. Next to that, I'm going to create my lightest value of black. So it's essentially going to be a light gray. I don't really need to dip my brush into the black to get much more pigment. Mostly what's left on my brush plus plenty of water is going to create a light enough value. I'm going to test those values out on a piece of scrap paper. There you can see my lightest value and my darkest value. Now let's go ahead and paint in these forms. And you notice that all my cast shadows are off to the right of the forms. I'm going to imagine that my light source is coming from the upper left corner of the paper. I'm going to start off with the sphere, which is one of the easiest forms to paint in. I leave an area of highlight and I'm painting around it with my lightest value. I then paint along the outer edge on the shadow side of the sphere. And I'm leaving an area there that's going to be the core shadow or the darkest area of the shadow. Now I'm going to clean off my brush and just wring it out a bit with my fingers, or you can use a sponge. I'm going to soften the edge of that highlight area. We covered softening edges in previous videos. I just want to touch along those edges to create a blend or a gradual transition from light to dark. Now, while this is still wet, I'm going to take my darkest value and fill in that area that I left for the core of the shadow. Now I'm going to clean off my brush, and then I take my lightest value and go around those edges to create a bit of a blend. And it's a little dark around the edges, so what I'm going to do is clean off my brush, dry it off. I'm going to use a lift out technique and soak up a little bit of the dark edges to lift out some of the paint on the bottom right of the sphere to create the effect of reflected light. I'm going to stop working on the sphere for now and give that a chance to completely dry before I go back in and put the cast shadow. I have a heat gun that I can dry these shapes off with, but I want to show you how you can manage, some ways you can manage your time if you don't have a hair dryer or a heat gun. So I'm going to let the sphere go and I'm going to shift my attention onto the cube. Since I don't have a background and I'm just going to leave it the white of the paper, I'm going to use a little trick to create an edge on that top corner, the upper corner of the cube. I take my lightest value, dab a little bit around that top corner of the cube, then take my second brush that I'm going to use to soften the edge, and I just touch the edge of that paint and drag it down a little bit toward the bottom of that top edge or top surface of the cube. See how that creates just a little bit of a gradation from dark to light. That way it'll stand out against that white background of the paper. While I'm waiting for that cube to dry, I get my darkest value and I want to put a bit more dark value into that core shadow of the sphere just to make it look very 3D. Then I take my other brush that's semi-wet and I soften all the edges around that core shadow. Now I return back over to the cube. I take my lightest value and I start at the top of the left side of the cube. That should be my second lightest value. I'm not going to finish it all the way down to the bottom. You'll see why here in a little bit. So then I take the same color and I'm going to fill in completely the right side of the cube, all the way down to the bottom of it. Now I'm going to take my clean semi-wet brush and soften that bottom edge In fact, what I'm doing is dragging some of that color down to the very bottom of the cube. You'll see later on that's going to create the effect of reflected light. Now I'm not going to worry about it drying that much, and I'm going to take my lightest value and continue painting the cast shadow, the shape of the cast shadow for the cube. Then I'm going to take my semi-wet clean brush and soften the edge of that cast shadow, especially the areas that are the furthest away from the cube. Cast shadows tend to go from dark to light and more crisp and hard-edged to softer as they move away from an object. Give that a chance to dry. Now I'm going to take my lightest value and go over, starting from the top down, that entire right side of the cube. I want it to look darker than the left side. So by layering this value over top, it's making it darker. Then I take my clean semi-wet brush and I'm going to soften the bottom edge so that it blends into the cast shadow. We're not done with that area yet. And now while it's still wet, I'm going to take my darkest value and just dab into the top corners and along the side a little bit and let that blend into the rest of it. I'll soften it a little bit. And what that's doing again here is it's creating the effect of a darker area towards the top and an area of reflected light toward the bottom of the cube. I'm going to let that all dry before I return and finish the cast shadow in the cube. Now I'm going to work on the cast shadow for the sphere. I take my lightest color, start right up next to the bottom edge of the sphere and paint in an ellipse or a flattened circle shape for that cast shadow. Since my light source is coming from the upper left, I'm making it a little bit off center towards the right. After I have that filled in, I take my clean semi-wet brush and soften the edge of that cast shadow, especially the areas that are furthest away. Sometimes it takes several times to soften it until you have the right amount of gradation or softness. While that is still wet, I get my darkest value and dab it in right on that bottom edge of the sphere and then let it bleed and blend into the rest of that cast shadow area. And you can see how that creates a gradation from dark to light. Now back to the cube. Since I let the cube dry a bit, I'm going to get my darkest value this time. Paint right along the bottom edge of that cube within the cast shadow. Paint out away from it just a bit. And now I'm going to take my semi-wet brush and soften the edge of it and just kind of drag it out, soften it until it's a gradual transition from dark to light away from the cube. So I'm finished with those top forms. Now I'm going to move on to the bottom two. First, I'll start with the cylinder. I'm going to use the same trick I used for the cube up top. I'm going to take my lightest value color, dab a little across the top edge of that top side of the cylinder, and then take my semi-wet brush and soften that and drag it down toward the bottom of the top side of that cylinder. That way it'll just give a little bit of value up top to make it stand out from the white background. For these shapes, I'm going to use my heat gun and speed up the drying time. A hairdryer works just fine too. Now I'm going to take my lightest value, carefully paint in an area along the left edge. Then I'm going to leave or reserve an area of white for the highlight for the cylinder, a vertical area, and fill in the rest of the side of that cylinder, being careful to go right along the edge of that top side of the cylinder. Now I take my semi-wet brush that's clean and I soften both edges of that highlight. Now while that paint is still wet, I get my darkest value and I paint in a vertical section that comes in a bit from the right edge, closer toward the center. This is my darkest area of the form shadow, the core shadow. Now that paint was wet, but I want it to blend even more. So I take my semi-wet clean brush and I soften the edges of that core shadow to get as smooth a transition as I can. And it takes me a few attempts to really soften that edge to get it as smooth as I can get it. I'll take my heat gun and dry that off so I can work back into the cast shadow now. Starting with my lightest value, I paint right up to the edge of the cylinder within that area of cast shadow that I've drawn. And I'll fill it in working away from the cylinder. Now I don't go completely out to the edges of that drawn in cast shadow. I take my semi-wet brush and soften those edges so that they reach the rest of the way out. And I have to do this a couple times. I clean my brush out, dab it on the sponge again, and soften that edge even more to get the most gradual transition I can. Now I take my darkest value, dab it in right along the bottom edge of that cylinder. Pull it out from it a bit and then just let it bleed the rest of the way into that cast shadow to create a transition. I'll dry that off a bit. Now I'll work on the last form, which is a cone. The cone is similar to the cylinder, except of course it's triangular. I take my light value color, paint in just along the left edge, and then I leave a space. This time it's a triangular shape for my highlight. And I fill in the rest of the cone, reserving that white triangular shape for the highlight. And I even drag that color a bit out into the cast shadow. It's not going to matter. Now I take my semi-wet brush and soften each edge of that highlight. I have to do this a couple of times. I want to get it as smooth a transition as I can, but I need to make sure I leave white paper for that highlight. Before that paint has a chance to dry, I get my darkest value and I paint in that core shadow. It's sort of a wedge shape or a triangular shape as well. Take my semi-wet clean brush and I soften those edges. And you can see how rounded it makes that object. Before we finish that cast shadow, we've got to dry this off a little. Now for the cast shadow, I take my lightest value color, carefully paint along the bottom right side of that cone. Drag that paint out into a wedge shape for the cast shadow. Then get my semi-wet brush and soften those edges of the cast shadow. You can see I didn't fill in the entire shape of the cast shadow. I only filled it in part way, and then by softening those edges I drag it out further. And I'm going to clean my brush off again, drag that edge out even more so it just seems to fade away. Now I take my darkest value while that cast shadow is wet and just dab a little bit of that into the cast shadow right up against the object. I'm also going to emphasize the core shadow a little bit more. I want to make it a little bit darker, especially toward the top of the cone. So I paint in just a little bit of that darkest value and soften each edge of that core shadow. And now these forms are done. So what we have is a monochromatic painting of some basic geometric solid forms. Understanding the value structures and how to paint them is important for painting in more complex shapes and making them look three-dimensional. Let's review some of these value areas that we see on these forms. Each of these forms has an area of light, and within that area of light, especially on the rounded shapes, is a highlight. This is the area of greatest light reflection. In this case, I imagine my light source coming from the upper left. Then we have form shadows on each object. Within that area of form shadow, especially on the rounded surfaces, we have the core shadow. This is the darkest area or area of least light reflection in the object. We also have what's called reflected light. Reflected light is caused from light going past the form and then bouncing off of another surface and back into it. In this case, it's the table. Finally, we have what's called the cast shadow, shadows that are cast or thrown onto another surface. Understanding these value structures is very important for making any object look three-dimensional. That's all for today until we meet again in the next demonstration. Have a wonderful day, everybody.